I'm your host, BrightLearn, and today we have a truly eye-opening conversation to share with you. Recently, Mike Adams from brighteon.com sat down with Brian Berletic from the New Atlas, and their discussion is nothing short of a geopolitical masterclass. So grab your favorite beverage, settle in, and let's unpack this fascinating interview. Mike Adams kicks off the conversation by welcoming Brian Berletic, a geopolitical analyst whose work he deeply admires. Brian, joining from halfway around the world in Thailand, brings a unique perspective to the table. He's known for his meticulous research and clear presentation, and today he's here to discuss the intricate web of global politics, focusing on the United States, Russia, Ukraine, China, and Taiwan. Brian wastes no time in diving into the heart of the matter. He describes the current conflict in Ukraine as a U.S. proxy war with Russia, part of a broader strategy to overextend and distract Russia. But it doesn't stop there. Brian points out that the U.S. is also actively working to encircle and contain China, using similar tactics along China's periphery. He emphasizes that this is all part of a single playbook, one that's becoming increasingly transparent and, as he suggests, increasingly ineffective. Mike agrees, noting that the U.S., once the industrial powerhouse of the world, has squandered its post-World War II dominance through a series of misguided and abusive policies. He highlights the irrationality of U.S. leadership, suggesting that their actions are not just misguided but potentially catastrophic, not only for the U.S. but for Western Europe as well. The destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines is cited as a prime example of this self-defeating behavior, cutting off affordable energy to Europe while simultaneously demanding more munitions for the Ukraine conflict. Brian echoes this sentiment, describing the U.S. as a declining empire that's overextended and desperate to maintain its grip. He draws a historical parallel, noting that empires throughout history have followed a similar trajectory: rise, overextension, abuse, and eventual collapse. The speed at which this is happening today, he argues, is accelerated by the rapid spread of information, making the unraveling of U.S. hegemony more visible and rapid. The conversation then shifts to the topic of nuclear weapons, with Mike expressing concern over the irrationality of U.S. policy and the potential for catastrophic escalation. Brian agrees, emphasizing that the U.S.'s actions are not just risky but also morally reprehensible, particularly when it comes to the treatment of its allies. The Nord Stream incident, he says, is a clear example of the U.S. putting its own interests above those of its European allies, even if it means causing them harm. As the discussion progresses, Mike brings up the recent Pentagon leak, questioning whether it was a genuine security breach or a calculated operation. Brian finds it hard to determine, given the irrational nature of U.S. leadership, but he points out the oddities surrounding the leak, including the involvement of Bellingcat, an organization known for spreading disinformation. He suggests that the leak could be an attempt to create an off-ramp for the Ukraine conflict, allowing the U.S. to save face while retreating from a losing situation. The interview takes a personal turn as Mike asks Brian about his background. Brian shares his journey from a patriotic U.S. Marine to a disillusioned expatriate living in Thailand. His experiences in the military, particularly his growing awareness of the gap between U.S. rhetoric and reality, led him to question his role and eventually leave the service. His move to Thailand marked the beginning of his deep dive into geopolitics, driven by a desire to understand the truth and share it with others. Mike expresses admiration for Brian's approach, noting his reliance on Western sources to make his points, which often backfire on the narrative they're meant to support. Brian explains that he uses Western media to highlight the contradictions and truths that are often buried within their own reporting, making it harder for critics to dismiss his analysis. The conversation then shifts to the situation in Taiwan, with Mike expressing concern that the U.S. is setting the stage for another proxy war, this time with China. Brian agrees, describing Taiwan as a pawn in the U.S.'s strategy to contain China. He criticizes the U.S. for its hypocritical stance, noting that while it claims to support Taiwan, its actions are more about using the island to provoke China and maintain its own dominance in the region. Mike shares his personal connection to Taiwan, having lived there and being married to a Taiwanese woman. He worries that the U.S. is exploiting Taiwan in the same way it has exploited Ukraine, putting the island's people at risk for its own geopolitical goals. Brian concurs, emphasizing that the U.S.'s actions are not about the welfare of the Taiwanese people, but about maintaining its own hegemony. The discussion concludes with a hopeful note, as Brian points to the rise of multipolarism and the efforts of countries like China and Russia to build a more balanced global order. He highlights the Belt and Road Initiative as a prime example of this shift, offering infrastructure development that benefits both China and the host countries. Mike agrees, expressing hope that this new approach will lead to a more peaceful and prosperous world. And there you have it, folks. A riveting conversation that pulls back the curtain on the complex and often troubling world of geopolitics. If you want to hear more from Brian Berletic, be sure to check out his channel, The New Atlas, on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey. And don't forget to subscribe to BrightLearn for more thought-provoking discussions. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, take care and stay informed.
This has been a BrightLearn.ai summary of an interview between Brian Berletic and Mike Adams on April 18, 2023. The full interview is available at brighteon.com, where you can also find podcasts and special reports by Mike Adams and other creators. Visit naturalnews.com for full editorial coverage of this interview and breaking news on critical stories that will keep you informed and aware of what's really going on.